Hello everyone, Same Token here. You'll probably have noticed that you can only carry 2 weapons in Halo, a limit that has persisted throughout the franchise. At the time of Halo Combat Evolved's release, this was fairly novel compared to classic first-person shooters, but Halo quickly set a trend, and now you see it everywhere. But what effect does a restrictive weapon carry limit have on first-person shooters? So today, we'll be exploring where the 2-weapon carry limit fits into Halo's gameplay and believability, and how this compares to the mechanics in other first-person shooters. Early FPS games generally saw the player carrying a truckload of various killing devices: chainsaws, shotguns, crowbars, and miscellaneous? Across the length of these games, you'd slowly accumulate enough weapons to overthrow a small nation. This was an important part of their gameplay loop. So long as they had the ammunition, players always had the right tool for the job somewhere in their magic bag. Although this provided fun and exciting gameplay, Halo Combat Evolved wanted to try something new. Early development footage, when Halo was a Macintosh game, suggests that players may have lugged around a vast supply of weapons, just like all the other classic games. But after Bungie was purchased by Microsoft and Halo became an Xbox launch title, everything changed. Suddenly, they had a controller to work with instead of a mouse and keyboard. Adapting to this new control scheme involved ditching anything that required too many buttons. Thus, the golden triangle of guns, grenades, and melee was born. These 3 elements would be available to the player with the press of a single button, maintaining a simple yet exciting combat loop. B for melee, left trigger to toss a grenade, Y to switch weapon, and X to pick up a new weapon. Now, why would you need a dedicated button to pick up weapons? Surely the player would want to fill their arsenal with everything available. Doom, Quake, Half-Life, and Bungie's own Marathon all automatically pick up weapons for you. Well, that's because Halo introduced a 2-weapon carry limit. Players only had to worry about switching between the 2 weapons currently in their possession. And if they wanted something different, they had to hunt for it. And this had interesting implications on Halo's realism. Halo games have many arcadey elements, but they still seek to immerse you into a universe of ancient superweapons and galactic battles. The heads-up display elements are designed to make you feel as though you're peering through a futuristic helmet. And this only became more apparent with every Halo release, with those HUD elements now moving as you sway your head. Equally, from Halo 2 onwards, you can now see your legs. I can't be the only one who stared at them for hours when it was first released. Well, maybe I am, but it shows that Halo cares about delivering a certain feeling of realism, even if it does still require a level of suspension of disbelief. Or in other words, players are invited to not think too deeply about the weird and wonderful elements that wouldn't necessarily make sense in real life. We see this everywhere in fictional universes. For example, characters like the easygoing Nathan Drake from the Uncharted series has literally slaughtered hundreds of people. Yet when you're playing the games, you don't really think too much about that. And furthermore, the goalposts of this realism are completely malleable. Some games lean towards simulation, like the Arma series. Other games require players to forego reality entirely, like Time Splitters, where guns seem to float somewhere in front of the player. Honestly, everything in this game exists because it looks cool, and so players are likely willing to absorb, rather than reject, its outlandish nature. Halo strikes a middle ground between these 2 extremes. Halo has space zombies, ODSTs can break off and wield mounted turrets like it's Nerf or nothing, and an ancient alien has a British accent. That's where our suspension of disbelief has to kick in, as we allow ourselves to get absorbed into its universe. But carrying more than 2 weapons? Well, that's somewhat of a realistic element. From Halo 3 onwards, unused weapons are appended to either the Chief's holster or his back. Halo Combat Evolved could have had the Chief carry an armory's worth of weapons, and its world building wouldn't necessarily have suffered. But gameplay balancing is a different story. Players will adapt their approach to combat situations depending on the type and quantity of tools at their disposal. Games that give you access to all weapons can still restrict their use through resource scarcity. So, if they don't want you using rockets, they'll simply starve you of your rocket ammo. Games like Half-Life Alyx do this automatically. To ensure players always experience a fair and exciting challenge, the game continually assesses their resource levels to decide which items to leave around the map and how much. The 2-weapon limit is merely another tool with which they can tighten a player's sandbox, forcing them to come up with creative solutions. Now, the early Medal of Honor games also had a fairly small weapon limit, but they didn't allow players to choose what weapons they picked up from the battlefield. And, instead of a hard weapon limit, Perfect Dark Zero used a Tetris-style weapon inventory system, where smaller weapons would take up less space. Halo, on the other hand, is all about constantly swapping out weapons. Players can pick up almost everything the AI use. See a gun you want? Well, it's only a headshot away. Energy-based weapons, like the plasma pistol, encourage this, as they cannot be recharged. This mechanic also spices up co-op, as players now effectively share 4 inventory slots, or in the case of Halo 3 onwards, 8. Still less than something like Half-Life, especially if you consider that each player probably wants to keep at least one all-rounder. But it provides an interesting opportunity for teamwork, similar to how transferring the Scorpion's turret control from the driver and instead handing it to a passenger encourages cooperation. Players are forced to get creative when they have a limited set of tools, and especially when those tools are less than ideal. Thus, Halo has an element of inventory management that wasn't commonly seen in classic fast-paced first-person shooters. Players must make decisions based on limited information as to what weapons they should take into the next room. Should they hold on to the rocket launcher, which is taking up precious space, just in case they need it? Or should they live on the edge, constantly swapping weapons? And that's just on the first playthrough. Each time they play, they will improve their knowledge of the map. Picking up weapons becomes less of a gamble and more of a strategy. Perhaps they don't need those rockets, as the Magnum was far better for killing the hunters, while also being versatile enough to effectively kill grunts and jackals, and, well, everything else. Yes, the balancing in Combat Evolved wasn't always perfect, but overall, the carry limit, along with the available selection of weapons on the map, are used as compelling levers for adapting Halo's gameplay. Weapon carry limits affect the balancing in multiplayer too. Like playing co-op, this means players must share the weapon pool instead of accumulating everything on the map. This sets Halo apart from classic arena FPSs, which were defined by stockpiling weapons and raw skill. Players would utilize their large arsenal to pick the right weapon for the given moment depending on the enemy's positioning. Halo rearranged this with its 2-weapon carry limit. Suddenly, there was an element of inventory management, meaning players won't always have the right weapon for every situation. So there is a greater chance of a power imbalance between 2 players, and therefore another layer of strategy is required to best opponents. Now, many of Halo's maps are reminiscent of core arena shooters, and classic Halo game modes see weapons spread around the map for anyone to pick up. But we shouldn't ignore the large role Halo played in carving out a new genre of multiplayer, which over time has moved further from its arena roots with the addition of loadouts and abilities. Halo set in motion its trend of guns, grenades, and melee all at the push of a button. This made playing Halo with a controller a complete joy. But does this automatically make the 2-weapon carry limit the superior mechanic on console? It's tempting to say that the existence of the 2-weapon carry limit is simply down to the limitations of console controllers. Swapping between just 2 weapons allows players to quickly build muscle memory. Many older console FPS games that had players carry every weapon possible would force them to cycle through their entire inventory to find what they were looking for. Red Faction, released just before Halo Combat Evolved, was one of the worst offenders for cycling weapons. Using circle and square, you had to go through each weapon one by one. There comes a point in the heat of battle where you'll just give up and use anything. Half-Life's PS2 port handled this far better as it used the categories from the PC release. Using the directional buttons, you could swap between and within categories. Then Half-Life 2's Xbox port went even further by using a four-way menu, with each direction of the D-pad corresponding to its own category. Provided you found them, pressing down twice will always take you to the gravity gun, and right twice will always take you to the shotgun. Because new weapons are added to the end of the stack, the route to each weapon never changes, and so you can build muscle memory over time. Valve was essentially using the D-pad in the same way as they did with the PC version's hotkeys. It's true, PCs have far more keys to work with, and they benefit from having a scroll wheel that can cycle through weapons while the player is moving and turning. Something that would be rather tricky with a controller. But on the whole, if implemented correctly, large weapon loadouts do not present a disproportionate limitation on consoles compared to PC. There are plenty of console games that have no carry limits and yet use analog controls to their advantage. For instance, many have weapon select wheels that use the controller's thumbstick. Although there's the possibility of selecting the wrong weapon, players could still build that precious muscle memory. Now, cycling between two weapons is always going to be quicker during a firefight, regardless of platform. However, there are simple ways for games to implement both mechanics. The Half-Life releases on PC included a weapon toggle where players could switch between their current weapon and their previous weapon, mimicking the benefits of the two-weapon carry limit. Ultimately then, Halo's two-weapon carry limit doesn't exist just because it was a console exclusive. There were loads of console games released before and after that had players lugging around a vast arsenal, and many of these games were critically acclaimed. So one isn't always better than the other, and is very subjective as to which you prefer. This of course is in contrast to Halo's other unique mechanics that made it far better on console, such as perfecting softlock aim assist. As a design choice, it makes a great deal of sense if you're wanting players to switch weapons all the time during frantic engagements without slowing down. And of course this is especially true with controllers, where you don't want players having to lift off the thumbsticks too often. Now, it should be said that Halo wasn't the first console game to introduce that two-weapon carry limit. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, released on the PS1 in 1999, allowed players to carry only a shotgun, rifle, or SMG, and a sidearm. But like Arma, this was to enhance the game's realism, instead of encouraging players to run and gun. Instead, it was Halo that set the trend of the carry limit as a means to enhance the rate of combat, popularizing a brilliant tool for developers to add to their repertoire, especially for console FPSs, which were blowing up at the time. Games like Call of Duty, Left 4 Dead, Battlefield, and many more would go on to use a restricted weapon limit to enhance its fast-paced gameplay. While this doesn't mean it's better, it certainly means it's a playstyle that is popular among gamers. Ultimately, the two-weapon carry limit exists as an important part of Halo's gameplay loop, while also feeding into the player's immersion. And this is not just because it's a console game, though it does lend itself to the controller. Carry limits are interesting from a game design perspective. I personally like the weapon limit in Halo, even with additions like equipment in Halo 3 and armor abilities in Halo 4 and Reach. Halo was all about that golden triangle, and toggling between two weapons simply facilitates that flow. And then I also like having a whole bunch of weapons in Half-Life 2. They both fit with the respective gameplay loop each franchise wanted to achieve. But as I said before, this is highly subjective. Restrictions can encourage player creativity, but some may feel that only having two weapons places a limit on the fun. So with that in mind, how do you feel about weapon limits? Do you like both approaches, or do you prefer one over the other? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe and hit the bell icon for more. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you next time.